Good evening, everyone. Excuse me for reading, but these people are so accomplished that if I didn't read, I would leave out absolutely everything imperative. I am Dorothy Zinberg on the Kennedy School faculty, and on behalf of my late husband, Norman Zinberg's family, friends, and colleagues, and myself, I would like to welcome everyone to this much anticipated talk by Congressman Barney Frank. My pleasant task is to introduce the introducers. First, we're going to have Professor Howard Schaefer, who is a longtime collaborator of Norman's, and Professor Charles Nesson, an equally longtime friend of Norman's. I hope that they will forgive me as I reluctantly condense their many accomplishments into less than a megabyte. Professor Schaefer will speak briefly about Norman's work, and Professor Nesson will introduce Congressman Frank. Let me begin with Professor Schaefer, who is a psychologist on the faculty at Harvard Medical School and the founding director of the Norman Zinberg Center for Addiction Studies at the medical school and the Cambridge Hospital. Howard is a major researcher on the full range of addiction behavior, from drugs to alcohol to gambling, specializing in the social perception of addiction and disease. He is a prolific author of 6 books, more than 100 papers. He has spent his career on research, writing, and teaching that have helped shape the theory and the treatment of addictive behavior. He is also responsible for helping Norman's friends and family establish the Norman Zinberg Fellowships at the medical school, for which we are very appreciative. And I want to give a special welcome to those Zinberg Fellows who are here this evening. Now, Professor Charles Nesson of the law school has been at Harvard since he was an undergraduate. In 1981, he was an early designer of software, an unusual calling for a law school professor. And it is relevant to Professor Schaefer's work on gambling, because Professor Nesson wrote a computer program that played an excellent game of poker. Little known facts about famous people. And he's gone on, more importantly, to institutionalize this interest by establishing the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society at the law school. One word that characterizes Professor Nesson's work is openness. Whether in governance, education, law, or security, Professor Nesson is committed to preserving a public space on the internet, a task that becomes more difficult with each passing day. An innovative teacher and always the first to introduce the newest technology to his class, he had his freshman class wired to the O.J. Simpson trial some years ago. His commitment to a public space on the internet matches Norman's commitment to public justice in providing rational policies for dealing with possession of drugs and addiction, preferring mandatory drug treatment to mandatory jail time. Again, our thanks to Professor Schaefer and Nesson, as well as to Congressman Frank, for participating in tonight's discussion that so well captures the passion in Norman's work and life. Thank you.
I think I speak for most of us when I say that we've come to know Representative Frank as an outspoken, honest, and intellectually gifted politician. He has the ability to see things that others miss and provide insight where others remain superficial. He has a special energy and dedication that seems without equal, and in many ways he reminds me of Norman Zinberg. This memorial lecture is a special opportunity to remember Norman. Norman was my mentor and a very special friend. I've been blessed with many great teachers during my life, but none has been more powerful and enduring an influence than Norman. It's remarkable how many people Norman mentored during his incredible career, and how many people would say that he's been the most powerful influence on their lives and their careers. What's even more amazing is how enduring and powerfully inspiring his impact has been to the field of addiction studies. He's fathered many multidisciplinary intellectual and programmatic activities, and these are part of his remarkable legacy. For example, the Norman E. Zinberg AIDS Clinic at the Cambridge Hospital. He's influenced the worldwide research on controlled drug use and natural recovery. Norman is responsible in many ways for helping people all over the world understand the nature and form of clinical supervision in addiction treatment programs and understand that these things are essential to a quality care system. He's responsible in many ways for our Division on Addictions at Harvard Medical School. This is a multidisciplinary program that mixes science and public policy. Needless to say, if it wasn't for Norman, it might be narrowly disciplinary and quite different from the way it is today. For example, because of Norman's influence, we've developed an addiction science curriculum that brought science and addiction studies to adolescents. Why is this Norman's work? Because Norman taught us that everyone's capable of working in a scientific field and learning the lessons of addictive behaviors. We founded an Institute for Research on Pathological Gambling and Related Disorders. Again, Norman taught us that drugs and chemistry and biochemistry are not the sole domain of addictive disorders. And finally, one of our major activities is the Norman Zinberg Training Program in the Addictions and the Norman Zinberg Memorial Fellowship. Norman was mischievous. He always had a twinkle in his eye. He often said of his conceptual adversaries that we should include them at our scientific conferences and debates because they might learn something from him. His ability to challenge his mischief into thoughtful and useful challenges to the conventional wisdom was extraordinary. He was a visionary. He's provided the entire field with one of the most enduring and important motifs by showing us that biology and chemistry are insufficient to explain addictive disorders and drug effects. This is his famous Drug, Set, and Setting. In 1984, he published a book by that title. Norman's model for understanding drug effects, drug set and setting, is now being applied all over the world to understand how people experience gambling, computers, and many other activities that occasionally become an addictive pattern. Norman saw things as few people could. He taught us many important lessons, too many to list here, but I do want to list a few. First, I think, and perhaps foremost, he taught us to care for people who are struggling with their addictive behaviors with dignity and compassion, regardless how deviant their behavior might have seemed. He taught us that the bravado and deviance that we often see with addictions is simply a mask for the shame and humiliation associated with this experience. When critics thought that people struggling with addiction were absent integrity, he revealed their complex character, and as a result, he revealed our complex character as well. He learned about drug use and drug users by getting personal. He talked with them about their experience, and he even did this while they were using psychoactive drugs. And when he did, they revealed their character to him. When people thought that drug abusers lacked self-control, Norman demonstrated that they had a remarkable capacity for control. Norman taught us that contrary to conventional wisdom, the majority of people can use all kinds of powerful drugs in a controlled way. Over time and in the right setting, they could learn to control their relationship with these psychoactive drugs. At times when observers thought all drug use was drug abuse, Norman distinguished these patterns. He taught us that personality attributes often change in response to drug use rather than causing drug use. He taught us not to judge the nature of a person's character when they were using drugs or shortly after. He taught us that the apparently irrational behavior of substance abusers was more rational than it at first appears. He also taught us to learn what drug use means in the context of a human life and to understand how Norman always said, they do business with the world around them. He taught us to interpret human behavior as projection until proven otherwise. Norman's ideas were both complex and sophisticated, simple and elegant. He taught us to challenge conventional wisdoms. Each of the ideas that I just described really did change our knowledge, and as a result, it changed the world we lived in. Norman's work inspired a generation of scientists, clinicians, and public policymakers. This memorial lecture is a special tribute to his remarkable and enduring legacy. Ultimately, in my opinion, and I think many others, Norman is an American hero, often larger than life. He wisely advised me on many occasions not to meet heroes because their human attributes would ultimately lead to a fall from grace. But I can say with quite certainty that Norman was a hero when I first met him, and he's still a hero today. Norman was wise. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "Raphael paints wisdom, Handel sings it, Phidias carves it, Shakespeare writes it, Wren builds it, Columbus sails it, Luther preaches it, Washington arms it, and Watt mechanizes it." I would add about wisdom that Norman Zinberg lived it. Each of us has the opportunity to challenge conventional wisdom and improve the human condition, and when we do, Norman's with us. Special thank you to Dorothy for developing and sustaining what is a very special event, and now Professor Nesson to introduce Mr. Frank.
Now, Barney Frank is congressman from the 4th District of Massachusetts and now a 20-year veteran in the United States House of Representatives. The Almanac of American Politics calls him one of the truly gifted legislators of our time. Barney is a Harvard man. He graduated from the college in 1962, then studied here for a doctorate in political theory, but opted instead for the real thing, leaving in 1967 for the rough and tumble of Boston politics, serving as chief assistant to Mayor Kevin White. In 1971, he returned to Harvard as a fellow in the Institute of Politics. And in 1972, he ran and won a seat for himself in the Massachusetts legislature, where he served for 8 years. During that time, he returned again to Harvard, this time to Harvard Law School, graduating in 1977. Sad to say, Barney was not a member of any of the classes that I taught. Barney ran for Congress in 1980 on the slogan, "Neatness isn't everything." He has been serving in the Congress with growing reputation, both for wisdom and neatness ever since. His is a voice of reason on issues of military spending, Israel, healthcare, the war on drugs, and gay rights. He made history when, in 1987, he became the first member of the United States Congress to announce his homosexuality. He told the Boston Globe, "I don't think my sex life is relevant to my job, but I don't want to leave the impression that I'm embarrassed by it." In the election that followed, though his opponent attempted to make Barney's personal life an issue, Barney won 70% of the vote. He wins, and he will keep winning. "The House is a meritocracy," says his friend and colleague Ed Markey, and Barney has it all: a first-class intellect, a first-class legal mind, a first-class political mind, and a first-class sense of humor. He is irresistible, irrepressible, and inexorable, a cross between Louis Brandeis and Buddy Hackett. Republicans fear and respect him. He has said of them, "The right hand doesn't know what the far right hand is doing." And sure, they're pro-life. They believe life begins at conception and ends at birth. Republican Henry Hyde calls him a fearsome adversary who appears to enjoy his work, adding he's sharp, he's effective, and basically, he's a lot of fun. Norman Zinberg would be delighted that Barney is here to honor him. Like Norman, Barney has been motivated from the outset of his career by sensitivity to social justice, bigotry, and hypocrisy. He's been a strong advocate in the Congress for sensible reform of our nation's drug laws, introducing bills to allow medical use of marijuana and to restore discretion to judges to set aside mandatory minimum sentences for low-level, nonviolent drug offenders. As Barney said when he introduced these bills, "I've spent a lot of time trying to convince people that our drug policies are misguided, with too much emphasis on punitive measures and not enough on demand reduction efforts." These could well have been Norman's words. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Barney Frank.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here under these auspices. Charlie Nesson is someone I've admired and continue to admire for his pioneering work in legal education and the law, and Norman Zinberg was someone I had the privilege of working with and being inspired by, and it is nice to return to the Institute of Politics. Charlie gave my long history at Harvard. Actually, I would show you, if you have the brochure that they give out about the Institute of Politics, there was a picture taken at the opening of the Institute, taken 34 years ago, and I'm standing with my arms folded right under the picture of John Kennedy in 1966. And it's nice to be here with Dave Pryor. David, you will know that I made a terrible sacrifice to be here today. I could have been back at my job and your old job voting for the 20th continuing resolution of this year, which means that's the 20th pass we have taken at keeping the budget going while we work things out, and it is one of the aspects of the job David does not miss. We may have had a little bit of a glitch, but it's not a serious problem. I noticed this, the poster said mandatory sentencing. That really is just a part of what I want to talk about. We want to talk about drugs in general. So let me begin by picking up where Professor Nesson left off in his introduction. I think America's drug policy is the single most mistaken public policy we have in America. I mean, we have things that we try to do and they're difficult and they go back and forth, but I can't think of anything which is as wrong-headed as the drug policy, which wastes more money, which inflicts more damage, and does less. And it's a great example of the intellectual inconsistency of my conservative friends. There is a strain of conservative analysis that looks at various government programs and says, well, you guys meant well. You wanted to house poor people, but you built Columbia Point and Pruitt-Igoe. You wanted to keep kids from starving, but you built a welfare system. There's a kind of a results screen that they put on various public policies, and they say, you know, Lyndon Johnson said we're going to have a war on poverty. We still have poverty. To hell with it. And in area after area, they do that, usually ignoring the fact that these are inherently difficult problems, ignoring the fact that they, in some cases, made it harder for us to do these things, and finally ignoring the fact that we may have made some real gains. Strangely, they leave out of this form of policy analysis the biggest disaster we have, the drug program. I mean, if you take the analysis they apply to public housing, to welfare, to virtually any other area, and apply it to the drug policy, you get rid of the drug policy right away. It has spent more money for less harm. They say, oh, well, look, the problem's gotten worse with poverty, or the problem has gotten worse with housing. Well, it has gotten seriously bad with drugs. And in fact, the drug issue is the one thing I can think of where the cure is indisputably worse than the disease. The major harm that is done to American society from drugs comes not from the use of drugs, but from our misguided efforts to prevent people from using drugs. That doesn't mean that using drugs is some wonderful thing and we ought to be promoting it. Yes, we need to deal with this and to try to discourage it in various ways, but more harm comes from the way in which we go about it. And we were just talking about this. The Supreme Court of the United States, I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough, the terrible corrosive effect it has on our law enforcement practices. We have this concept of victimless crime. And usually when we talk about victimless crime, we talk about it from the standpoint of the inappropriateness of the society intervening in purely private matters. There's another aspect of victimless crimes, though, which we need to talk about. It is the very difficult burden it imposes on law enforcement. If you are a cop and you are told to prevent something from happening, your major ally is going to be the person who doesn't want it to happen to her. I mean, victims and cops are allies. Complainants and cops are allies. How do the cops know when a crime is being committed? Well, sometimes somebody yells or calls 911. Precisely the problem with drugs is, in many, many cases, not only do the victims not the victims, the participants in the crime don't tell the cops, they want to hide it from the cops. So if we are going to prosecute something like drug taking, in which the participation is overwhelmingly voluntary, then we have to instruct the police to be much more intrusive than usual. And we just had the Supreme Court decision in which a majority 6-3 said, You can't stop cars randomly to look for drugs. Well, we don't stop cars randomly to look for more serious criminals. We don't stop cars randomly to look for murderers, to look for rapists, to look for arsonists. In part, that's because in those cases, the cops have other ways of knowing the crime has been committed. In other words, when you set out to stop people from doing something that they want to do and that nobody is objecting to, you are telling the police to be much more intrusive. And that's why if you look at most of the controversies we have over police tactics, searches, etc., they almost all come out of the drug area. Because that's what happens when a society sicks law enforcement on people who really don't want law enforcement there. And it has, as I said, this corrosive effect on law enforcement. And as a matter of fact, we then react badly. I will tell you there are cases where we're told, well, we don't want the police doing that kind of search. If the police were searching for a kidnap victim in many of these cases, I'd be cheering them on. The problem with the searches is not always the procedure, it's the substance. What the hell are the poor cops doing? And it's not, the cops aren't volunteers in this, we tell them to do it. What the hell are the poor cops doing turning over places looking for marijuana? If they were looking for a kidnapped victim, I would have very different rules. So one of the major costs we pay for victimless crimes is the extent to which it requires these excessively intrusive police tactics. A next problem is just the cost. We spend an enormous amount of money trying to interdict drugs. This is a very free society. Millions of people come and go, packages come and go. Maybe China could keep drugs out of China. There is no way a free society can physically keep drugs out of America. Once again, the conservatives have been totally inconsistent. They're the ones who correctly point out the power of the market. They correctly point out that hundreds of millions of Americans with money at their disposal who want to buy things are probably going to be able to buy them. And they make that point correctly, and that's something we need to take into account more than we often have when we regulate. But why the hell do they think it doesn't apply to drugs? There is no way a free society can keep drugs out. If you said to the Border Patrol and the INS and all the military and everybody else, do not allow any horses to be smuggled into America, they would probably do a pretty good job of reducing the number of horses smuggled into America. As the commodity you are trying to keep out shrinks in size, the ability of law enforcement in this free society with so many people coming and going goes away. When people can put things in their body cavities, in the heels of their shoes, in their cars, in various places, it is virtually impossible to keep it out. People said, how come we can't keep drugs from coming over the Mexican border? Because we cannot keep people from coming over the Mexican border. People are much larger than drugs. They are more easily spotted. They are less easily concealed. And in fact, they are less in demand, although there are Americans who will pay these people. Americans with a lot of money will pay a lot more for a small amount of drugs than they will pay for a large amount of Mexicans. I mean, the fact is, and people ought to understand, that is why it is impossible to do interdiction. So what you do is waste billions of dollars. Now, the military used to be against that. I was in Congress in the early 80s when people said, we're going to have the military interdict drugs. And Caspar Weinberg and others said, what are you, crazy? We have serious things to do. We can't be doing that. And what do they do? You know, are they supposed to shoot down unarmed planes that cross the line? We had balloons we were going to put up. The military in the early 80s resisted drug interdiction as a mission. They said, this is not something we want to do. At the time, of course, they had Ronald Reagan giving them more money than they could spend sensibly. What then happened was, with the demise of the Cold War and the loss of the Soviet Union as our enemy, the military began to be cut back. And the military has switched its position on drug interdiction because while it is a poor substitute for communism as a source of funding, something is better than nothing. And the military has now embraced as a funding source interdiction when they cannot do it thoughtfully and seriously. So that is a great waste. The next thing, of course, that you pay for is the disproportionate jailing, particularly of racial minorities. The major reason we have a disproportionate imprisonment beyond what is rational has to do with who gets locked up. I mean, the fact is that it seems pretty clear to me that both George Bush and Al Gore when they were younger, engaged in activities involving illegal substances, which were at the time that they did them and still are illegal. Neither one of them had the remotest chance of being involved with law enforcement, nor, if they were involved with law enforcement, going to prison. There are people in prison today for doing things that George Bush and Al Gore did. And what you get is, we obviously have some disparities in the criminal justice system. I am less concerned, you know, if people are shooting other people, and only some of the people who shoot people go to jail, and the other people who shoot people don't go to jail, I'm worried about the people who shot people who didn't go to jail. I want to be very clear with regard to sentencing in general. I want to separate this out. Mandatory sentencing in some cases, I don't know, if you are addicted to shooting people or otherwise physically injuring them, I'm perfectly prepared to wave goodbye to you as you disappear behind the walls. There are people in this society, sadly, between whom and me, I would like something very solid and restraining. The problem again and again is when we apply this to the drug issue. That's where a lot of these problems come in. And frankly, I think you can make a case for, just as you can make a case for certain search techniques by the police, you can make a search for mandatory sentencing after a certain period with people who have seriously harmed other people. The problem, frankly, is that you discredit those concepts, which may have some relevance elsewhere, when you apply them in this drug area. Then, of course, we have and by the way, the mandatory sentencing thing has become a real problem, not just with racial minorities. Congress in 1996 passed a law making it retroactive that you be mandatorily deported for minor offenses, which did not require you to be deported in 1996. We've been working on trying to get that changed. And I am hoping that a bill will pass this week that will do away with that and will in fact do away with retroactivity retroactively, so that in some cases people who have already been deported will be able to come home. Some of these, by the way, are people who, for instance, came from the Azores, in the cases I'm familiar with, at the age of 2, and are now being deported to a country where they do not speak the language, do not know anybody. Apparently it is our theory that there was some taint of the blood that they brought with them, and the fact that they became ill-behaved was not due to any American societal experiences, but to their racial problem. I do remember reading some research recently about Mexican immigrants to Los Angeles, and it was for teenagers, the longer they stayed in Los Angeles, the more likely they were to be in trouble with the criminal justice system. Hard to argue that it was Mexico's fault that they got more into behavioral problems. But the one thing I was not able to get in this law under Republican rule was to apply it to people who had minor drug offenses. So people guilty of very minor drug offenses will not be repatriated under this law. I regret that. We've had other problems like this. Efforts to end the harshness have been problematic. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of the negative causes are, particularly with regard to marijuana, the refusal to allow doctors to prescribe marijuana. That is really quite extraordinary. Again, my conservative friends have made a pretty good political living trying to defy our efforts to extend health care to people on the grounds that the government should not be interfering with the doctor-patient relationship. I mean, that's gotten harder for them to sustain in the days of the HMO, but that's still a powerful argument. But I have never seen an interference with the doctor-patient relationship that remotely approaches the 535 of us telling doctors that they cannot prescribe marijuana to someone who has AIDS or cancer and is in terrible pain and finds this to be relieving. And I have heard my colleagues pronounce medical opinions, well, but there are other alternatives. We have the faintest idea what we're talking about in this regard. And what's interesting, and we ought to be clear, much of this hypocrisy and inconsistency, I believe, and let me just get now briefly into the attitudinal issues and then what I think we do about it. Much of it has to do with the fact that drugs became identified at various parts in American history, not just as a form of recreation, but as a form of cultural rebellion. That is why we punish smoking marijuana much more seriously than we punish drinking alcohol, because people are offended at this notion of cultural rebellion. I remember in the late 60s there was a commission appointed to consider the legalization of marijuana, and they could not think of a good reason not to. But they came out against it on the grounds that it would be culturally disorienting for people to do this. So we have gotten this kind of element in the culture war. We're still punishing young people, even the young people. We're punishing people who used to be young people and who were rebellious young people by this particular situation. So again, I think we do enormous harm. We waste a lot of money. We erode our civil liberties. One of the things that even finally the Republicans joined in doing last year was to change the law. And again, drugs made it the key. The law which allowed law enforcement to seize your property on the grounds that the property had been used in a criminal enterprise or was the fruit of a criminal enterprise, and then you had the burden of proof to prove that you were innocent to get it back. And we had people never even charged with a crime who had property taken away from them. And again, the major reason for that had to do with drugs. So that this war on drugs, given the victimless nature of it, given the fact that of all the crimes we care about, it is the one where the police get least voluntary cooperation from anybody, it clearly is a major reason for distorting our law enforcement. It is a major reason why we have a racial disproportion in terms of people being locked up. It wastes a great deal of money. It also, of course, interferes with other countries. I think one of the greatest examples of arrogance I've seen is when we, every year, decide which is a good country and which is a bad country from the standpoint of drugs. We give countries grades of unacceptable because they grow too many drugs to sell to Americans. I mean, we are the world's leading consumer of drugs by far, and we then denounce other people who have the temerity to meet the demand that the Americans send out there. So then the question is, all right, what do we do about it? Some things are relatively easy. Clearly, we ought to make it legal for doctors to prescribe marijuana. We allow doctors to prescribe things that are so much more habit-forming, mind-altering, et cetera, that the ban on medical marijuana is an embarrassment. Clearly, we ought to make it impossible for people to be jailed for the possession of marijuana and even the small-scale transactions when people trade off one marijuana cigarette to another. We also ought to prevent interdiction from being a high priority. That does not mean that as long as it's an illegal substance, if you walk in with a suitcase full and your suitcase falls open, I don't expect the INS to look the other way, but law enforcement has to have priorities. And the priority we give to looking for drugs is outrageous. And once again, I go back to this other point. It's led to strip searches. It led to this profiling where, and by the way, racial profiling in New Jersey, as you know, the New Jersey response to racial profiling was, well, don't blame us. The Drug Enforcement Administration made us do it. They're the ones who told us to stop blacks and Hispanics. It's the racial profiling over drugs that led black women, Caribbean women, to be strip searched at a disproportionately high level when they were trying to come into the country. So those, I think, as I said, are fairly easy. We do away with the mandatory sentencing. Let me get down to the tough issue, and then I want to throw this open, and that is, do we take what some would argue is a logical step of simply repealing laws against your decision as an adult to ingest various substances, as long as you're not driving or operating machinery or doing other things that you shouldn't be doing? There are a couple of problems with it. First of all, I must tell you, I think it's important. I'd like to get to medical marijuana. I'd like to get rid of the mandatory sentencing for drugs, to get rid of interdiction, to deal with some of these other issues. Once you begin to debate complete legalization, and I know people say, we're not talking about legalization, we are talking about decriminalization. I have a confession to make. I have never yet been able to understand what the hell the difference is supposed to be. I mean, if it's not against the law to use it, I don't know what does that mean it's decriminal but not legal? People said, well, decriminal means it's not against the law, but the government isn't telling you to do it. Well, I don't want the government to tell me to do almost anything. I think I am not in the business of the government encouraging things. In fact, I have been among those critical of the Chinese government for its abuse of the practitioners of Falun Gong, but I did decline to join in calling for the promulgation of Falun Dafa Week in Massachusetts to encourage everybody to engage in it, because I can't imagine why anyone would take my advice on whether or not to engage in something I don't know anything about. So I'm not into that, but I do want I do understand. Once you say, okay, the issue is this legal or not, that will subsume all other debates. And there was clearly a lot of cleaning up to do, short of making it legal. But there's another even more serious problem. There is, in the minority community, an ambivalence here, particularly among African Americans. Many African Americans are among those who, well, they've got a dual situation here. One, they are very critical of the discriminatory enforcement. President Clinton just acknowledged his frustration in not being able to do away with the disparity in sentencing between crack and powdered cocaine. Powdered cocaine used by upper middle class white people, crack used by poorer black people, and we punish crack cocaine much more than we punish powdered cocaine. And I'm glad to know that the president thinks we should have changed that. His voice was not the most audible on that one. Some of us were fighting to try to do that. But you also get, well, there's criticism among African American leaders for the disproportionate racial bias in the way in which we enforce this against users. There is also criticism on their part that interdiction is not effective enough. You have heard African Americans say, well, they're letting this stuff come into our communities. If they wanted to keep it out, they could. I don't think that's true, but I do think, yeah, there are very responsible leaders whom I admire and befriend, Charlie Rangel and Maxine Waters, who are concerned that we have not been tough enough on drugs. And what they say is, in effect, look, this society has allowed so much social disorganization into some minority communities that if, in fact, you take all constraints off the availability of some of these substances, a response on the part of some of the younger males who have been the victims of this social instability and destabilization will be excessively to use these. I think it is important for those of us who share the commitment to dealing with racial problems in society to work that out before people engage in a full-scale call for making everything legal. And it does seem to me reasonable for people to say, all right, what are you going to have in place to discourage it? What are you going to have in place to make sure that you don't get this kind of victimization? In any case, there is a great deal that can be done to diminish it. And at the very least, we ought to be clear that the greater harm now comes by far from the way in which we try to discourage people from using drugs rather than their use of it. And you can get rid of that harm without fully going to a situation of legalization. Now, I must tell you, I am not one of those liberal politicians who believes that the public is always better on the issues than the politicians. I have been in this business 28 years, and I, as I've said before, believe that politicians make a lot of mistakes, but the public is no bargain either on many cases. And very often when it comes to the rights of minorities, referenda are much worse, whether it's race or sexual orientation, than you can do in legislatures. But in the case of drugs, and particularly marijuana, the public is ahead of the politicians. My colleagues, including the Democrats, are terrified of being accused of being soft on drugs. Every state that's had a referendum on medical marijuana has won it. By the way, if you want to hear hypocrisy, you want to hear conservatives suddenly decide that money in political campaigns is not a good idea. Listen to them fulminate about George Soros, who's helped fund a few marijuana referenda. But the public understands what they are doing. I think the public is ahead of the politicians in this situation. The public is willing to introduce some rationality into this. The politicians continue to go on the other way. One of the things, if you're an undergraduate, you will be encountering, or a graduate student, if you're getting any kind of student aid, you will know that your renewal form now requires you to check off whether or not you have ever been convicted of any substance abuse. And if you have been, you may lose your financial aid. By the way, if you have been an arsonist, an auto thief, a burglar, if you have engaged in aggravated assault, if you have been guilty of driving under the influence of alcohol, you're okay. But if you got caught inhaling at the wrong time and you got any kind of a sentence, you're not. That's an example of the disproportion. So I think, and the final thing, of course, is we should take some percentage of the money we are now wasting on interdiction, and it certainly ought to be, let's have a new entitlement. Anyone who comes in and establishes medically that he or she is addicted to any substance, in our own interest and in the name of humanity, let's give them whatever treatment we can. And people say, well, the treatment doesn't always work. Right, that's why you have to do a lot of it. It is very important. The single most, and I will tell you that we still don't have that situation. So stop the interdiction, legalize medical marijuana, stop the mandatory sentencing, stop locking people up just for the possession in particular, and let's have an entitlement to treatment. Once we've done those things, we will then, I think, get to the issue of whether or not you make it entirely legal. That is an issue which has a neat philosophical answer for many who are on the libertarian side, and I tend to be there on the personal issue, but it is complicated by the racial and other issues. But the others are not complicated. We do an enormous amount of harm. We have begun to deal with that a little bit, but I think, and I would say this finally, what I would urge is for a coalition of people concerned about racial fairness, because clearly one of the greatest elements of racial unfairness is the disproportionate way in which we administer the drug laws. Again, you saw it with racial profiling. You see it with who's locked up. We get people concerned with civil liberties, with abusive law enforcement. And I really believe that the single greatest cause of abusive law enforcement techniques today is the requirement we put on law enforcement officers to do drugs. If they were not under that pressure, you would have much less in that area. I think the public is willing to respond, and I think it's time for us to make this a major political issue. Thank you.
All right, we have microphones, one here, and there are some in the balcony, although I have trouble seeing there. And Barney is at his absolute best in the give and take. So we invite you to step to the microphone and start us off.
Yeah, Congressman Frank, thanks for coming. My name is Tal Clement. I'm a Kennedy School student. I'm also a law student. And
now you're in real trouble.
yeah, and I plan to be a public defender, so I agree with pretty much everything you say. My question is that very often one of the strongest arguments against legalization and also against the racial disparity issue is that really what the harm is not necessarily drug abuse, but it's drug dealing and public drug dealing in certain low-income communities. And it's one of the arguments I have the hardest time responding to. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the argument that basically the justification for some of these disparities is the disproportionate harm that results from drug dealing. And secondly, I'm wondering what your opinion is of programs such as community policing, weed and seed, things like that, that provide more law enforcement resources for low-income communities, but that could have the end result of increasing racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system.
Well, you hit on what I think is the toughest issue, which is the ambivalence in the African-American community in particular about both the harm and the others. First, to acknowledge what you say, yes, the drug dealing clearly was a problem. You know, one of the major problems with the drug dealing is they hit innocent bystanders. I mean, in fact, Professor Neston may know this better than I, and others know these statistics, but I believe that one of the reasons people have said we got a downturn in the murder rate was that some of the turf wars were settled over drugs. I mean, that much of the, we had a movement over the years. For a long time, most murderers knew the person they murdered before they murdered them. Murders tended to be among people who knew each other. Stranger murders have increased, and they are, of course, a lot scarier to people in terms of no warning, et cetera. And a large part of that had to come with the shooting out over drug wars. I mean, analogous to the machine gun fights over prohibition. The first thing I would say is this. It should be possible for law enforcement to move in on that kind of violence and arrest the people for the violence without arresting the customers. I mean, that's part of it. The dealers, who tended to be more of a problem, could be arrested, but it became inevitable the customers people went after. Now, maybe it was because you got the customer to get to the dealer, but I would not have included going after the customers. That is, I think there are ways to reduce the violence of the drug dealing without this. Now, of course, the other issue you have is this, and you know how we got rid of the wars. Prohibition caused a lot of shooting. I mean, you've all seen Edward G. Robinson and Humphrey Bogart shooting it out with Tommy guns. How do we get rid of that? By legalizing alcohol. I mean, to some extent, the turf wars are a consequence of its illegality. You do not have, I mean, yes, people sell drugs in the black community. People sell clothing in the black community. But you do not have wars among clothiers in the black community or anywhere else about who gets to sell on which corner, because clothing is not illegal. So to some extent, we have forced that on ourselves. As far as community policing and weed and seed, I'm all for them as long as it is, you got the seed as well as the weed. That is, yes, there ought to be, I mean, as I learned in 1968 working for Kevin White, there were two complaints that came from minority communities about policing. One, the cops would sometimes be too tough. But even more, it was that the cops weren't there when they needed them, that law enforcement resources weren't sent to the poor people. And I think, yeah, it's an obligation of the society to go into troubled areas and provide enough police so that the overwhelming majority of innocent and honest people who live there aren't terrorized. So I'm all in favor of those things. But I would say, do a lot of that, just don't target the consumer, don't target the user, and that would substantially reduce it. And if and when you get to legalization, that is also, of course, the ultimate answer.
Up here in the balcony, would you tell us your name and state your question?
Hi, I'm Karen Kalish. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'm from Washington, D.C., so I'm delighted to see you again, Congressman Frank. I wonder if you would weigh in on two issues that were not on the agenda for tonight. One is Israel. Specifically, what do you see as the relationship if George Bush is elected president? And the other is, I would love to hear your views on what's going on with this election.
Well, I don't want to get too distracted. With regard to what George Bush's relationship with Israel will be, I don't know. Of course, one of the major figures in the Israeli relationship in the administration of President George Bush is really a segue into your next question, because he is James Baker, who has endeared himself to millions in this most recent situation. So, but I honestly do not know. I will tell you I am discouraged by what I see, because I do believe that under Ehud Barak, Israel made an extraordinarily generous set of peace proposals for a democratic society, which included not just what went on in Palestine, but the unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon, an agreement to withdraw from virtually all of the Golan Heights, and I'm discouraged that the price for peace may be higher than any democratic elected government in Israel could pay. So I think that's probably going to dictate whatever the relationship is. As far as the presidential thing is concerned, again, I don't want to distract us too much, but it does occur to me, well, 3 points. First of all, this notion that we are suffering because of this delay is simply flatly wrong. Nothing has not happened that should have happened, because we don't know who the president is yet, and nothing has happened that shouldn't have happened. That is, there has literally been zero harm to any cognizable interest. You know, there's a very strong tradition that presidents-elect do not meddle. Franklin Roosevelt resisted. Herbert Hoover tried like hell to get him to get involved in the economic situation. He said, no, thank you. The only time we think a president-elect did get involved was when Nixon may have helped sabotage peace talks. But literally, this notion, oh, this is terrible, nothing's happened. Nothing has gone wrong. In fact, Congress is functioning. I was on the floor of the House last Tuesday passing a housing bill with Rick Lazio. I'm the senior Democrat in the Housing Subcommittee. Lazio is the chairman of the Housing Subcommittee. I was campaigning for Hillary Clinton. He's not sending me a Christmas present, but it didn't stop us from passing a bill. So, I mean, that's the first thing I would say, is that, which means, it leads me to the second thing, there's no time problem here. Nothing is happening. You know, we got the benefit of the fact that when they set up all these schedules, it took a long time to ride a horse from Washington to anywhere else. And therefore, we have all this extra time. We're still on horseback time. And we have all these months. So what if it takes a little longer? The second thing, therefore, is that this pressure to move quickly